The year is 1279 BCE. In the temple complex of Karnak, Thebes, a young woman named Nefertari kneels before an altar of polished granite. She is 14 years old. She was chosen 3 years ago from her village along the Nile, selected for her beauty and unmarked skin to become one of the temple virgins, the consecrated servants of Amun-Ra. Her parents wept with pride when the priests arrived. Their daughter would serve the gods. She would live in luxury. She would want for nothing. They had no idea they had just sold her into a system of abuse so calculated, so systematic, that it would continue unbroken for over 1,000 years. What happened to Nefertari and thousands of girls like her wasn't written on the temple walls. It was hidden in the shadows between the hieroglyphs, buried in private letters that priests never meant to survive, and uncovered only when archaeologists started asking questions that made Egyptologists deeply uncomfortable, because ancient Egypt's temples weren't just houses of worship. They were sealed institutions of absolute power where religious authority became indistinguishable from sexual control. The question isn't whether you're ready to hear what happened in those sacred spaces. It's whether you're willing to understand how religion has been weaponized against the vulnerable across every civilization in human history. If you've ever wondered why certain ancient practices were glorified while others were carefully erased from tourist brochures and museum displays, you're about to discover the truth that Egyptology tried to keep in the archives. Here at Crimson Historians, we dig into the papyri that were never meant to be translated. Temple records recovered from Deir el-Medina, private priestly correspondence found in Amarna, Roman accounts of Egyptian temple practices that were dismissed as propaganda until archaeological evidence proved them accurate. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these buried truths into the light. Now, let's return to Nefertari's story, because the ceremony she's about to undergo isn't what her parents imagined when they offered their daughter to the gods. To understand what happened to temple virgins, you need to understand the system that consumed them. The institution of temple virgins in ancient Egypt emerged during the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, and continued through the Ptolemaic period, spanning roughly 2,000 years. These weren't priestesses in the way we understand religious women. They were property. A papyrus recovered from the Temple of Mut at Karnak, dated to the reign of Ramesses II and translated in 1952 by French Egyptologist Pierre Montet, describes the selection process with chilling bureaucratic precision. The consecrated virgin must be of the people, not noble blood, must be between ages of 11 and 14, must be physically unblemished, with no scars or deformities, must be certified virgin by examination of the temple physician. Once selected, the child is removed from family permanently. She becomes property of the temple estate, subject to the authority of the high priest in all matters of body and soul. Think about that for a moment. 11 to 14 years old, physically examined for virginity, removed from family, property. This wasn't devotion. This was systematic acquisition of children for purposes that the priests themselves documented in records they believed would remain sealed forever. Nefertari's first night in the temple complex is preserved in an unusual source, a letter written by her childhood friend, Hinatawi, who managed to visit the temple decades later and recorded what Nefertari told her. The letter, discovered in a sealed jar at Deir el-Medina in 1886, and now housed in the Cairo Museum's restricted archives, describes the purification ceremony that all new temple virgins underwent. It wasn't a ceremony. It was ritualized abuse disguised as religious necessity. The newly selected girls were brought to a chamber beneath the main temple. A room with no windows and only one entrance, where they were bathed by older temple virgins who whispered warnings they weren't allowed to speak aloud. Then the high priest entered. In Nefertari's time, this was a man named Bakan Kansu, whose tomb and titles are well documented. He held the position of High Priest of Amun for 4 pharaohs and wielded power second only to the king himself. What he did to new temple virgins was recorded by a disgusted Greek physician named Diodorus Siculus, who visited Egypt in the 1st century BCE and documented practices he witnessed. Diodorus wrote in his Bibliotheca Historica, preserved across multiple manuscript traditions, the Egyptian priests claim they must verify the purity of virgins dedicated to the gods through physical examination of an invasive nature. But this verification occurs not once but repeatedly. Throughout the girl's service, always in private, always without witness, always at the priest's discretion. One does not require extensive wisdom to understand what truly occurs in those sealed chambers. Later archaeological discoveries confirmed what Diodorus only implied. In 1924, during excavations at the Temple of Isis at Philae, archaeologists discovered a sealed room containing medical instruments and disturbing artifacts, a collection of linen bindings stained with blood, shackles sized for children, and a papyrus fragment describing restraint procedures for resistant virgins during necessary purification rituals. The excavation report was quietly archived and not published in mainstream Egyptological journals until 2001, when researcher Rosalind Park forced its release through academic pressure. By then, the evidence had mounted beyond denial. Nefertari's daily life in the temple followed a pattern documented across multiple temple sites. The virgins lived in segregated quarters, forbidden from contact with their families, forbidden from leaving the temple complex, and subjected to absolute authority of the priests. A tax record from the reign of Thutmose III, recovered from Theban administrative archives, lists temple virgins not among people but among property assets, valued between grain stores and furniture. Their duties were officially described as maintaining sacred purity through service to divine presence. But private letters between priests tell a different story. A correspondence between 2 mid-level priests at Karnak, discovered in a ceramic jar in 1902 and housed in Berlin's Egyptian Museum, includes this passage. Brother Amenemope writes that the new virgin assigned to his chamber services resists the evening purifications. He requests guidance on whether discipline should be applied privately, or if example must be made before the other virgins to ensure compliance. I have advised private discipline. Public example creates sympathy among the others, which undermines necessary authority. That phrase, evening purifications, it appears in dozens of temple documents. It was code. Another papyrus, this one from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, and dated to approximately 1400 BCE, includes a schedule of purification rotations that assigned specific temple virgins to specific priests on specific nights. Besides some names are notations. Compliant, requires supervision, disciplined successfully. These weren't religious ceremonies. They were scheduled abuse masked in sacred language, protected by religious authority, and enabled by a system that gave priests absolute power over girls who had no legal recourse, no family protection, and no means of escape. If this doesn't disturb you yet, you haven't fully grasped what's being described. Nefertari remained a temple virgin for 12 years. Her friend's letter describes visiting the temple when they were both 26 and barely recognizing the woman Nefertari had become. Her eyes were empty. sister." She moved as one does who has forgotten she once possessed will. When I asked if she was well, she smiled as one smiles at a stranger's politeness and said, "I serve the gods. I am blessed." But her hands shook when she spoke, and she flinched when a priest passed behind her. This was not my friend. This was what remained after the gods had taken everything else. That description, recorded in a private letter never meant for historical record, captures what official texts never could. The psychological destruction of temple virgins wasn't collateral damage. It was the point. Breaking these girls into absolute submission demonstrated priestly power, reinforced temple hierarchy, and ensured silence about what occurred behind sacred walls. The system maintained itself through several mechanisms documented in archaeological and textual evidence. First was isolation. Temple virgins had no contact with the outside world except during public festivals, where they appeared veiled and silent, performing ritualized dances that demonstrated temple prestige. Any virgin who attempted to flee was hunted down by temple guards. A legal text from the reign of Seti I describes the punishment for escaped temple virgins. "The runaway virgin shall be returned to the high priest's authority. She has violated sacred vows and must undergo extended purification to restore her fitness for divine service. The priest's judgment in her purification is absolute and not subject to secular review." Translation: Priests had legal authority to punish escaped virgins however they wished, with no oversight. Multiple papyri from different temples reference virgins who died during extended purification, with no explanation required, and no investigation conducted. Second was religious manipulation. The girls were taught from childhood that their bodies belonged to the gods, that priestly attention was divine favor, that resistance was blasphemy punishable in this life and the next. A teaching text recovered from a temple school at Memphis instructs, "The virgin must understand that her flesh is sacred vessel. When the priest enters her chamber, it is the god who approaches. To refuse the priest is to refuse the divine. Such refusal poisons the land, angers the gods, brings plague and famine. The virgin who resists carries responsibility for all suffering that follows." Imagine being 14 years old, isolated from family, and told that refusing abuse would cause your entire nation to suffer divine punishment. That's not religious instruction. That's psychological warfare against children. Third was complicity from the broader system. Pharaohs supported temple authority because temples controlled vast wealth and political power. Families didn't question what happened because having a daughter serve in the temple brought prestige and tax exemptions. The few voices that did object were silenced. A letter from a father demanding his daughter's return, written during the reign of Ramesses IV, and discovered at Thebes, received a response from the high priest that survives on the reverse of the papyrus. "Your daughter is no longer yours. She belongs to Amun-Ra. Your demand is blasphemy. Continue this protest and you will be charged with impiety against the gods." The father's subsequent letters stop. We don't know if he was silenced through intimidation or something worse. What happened to Nefertari specifically is recorded in the final section of her friend's letter. After 12 years of temple service, at age 26, Nefertari was released from her vows. This was rare. Most temple virgins either died in service, their deaths recorded in temple registers with no explanation, or became too old to maintain the fiction of virginity, and were transferred to lower status positions as temple servants. But Nefertari's release came with conditions. She was forbidden from marrying, forbidden from having children, required to maintain lifelong silence about temple practices under threat of execution for revealing divine mysteries. She lived out her remaining years in a small house outside Thebes, supported by a modest temple pension, and according to her friend, never smiled again, never spoke of the gods, and flinched at the sound of temple bells until the day she died. The archaeological record confirms this pattern extended far beyond individual cases. Excavations at multiple temple sites have uncovered mass graves of young women buried in unconsecrated ground outside temple complexes. A 2007 study of skeletal remains from a burial site near Karnak identified remains of 43 females, aged approximately 12-30, buried without grave goods or proper mummification, indicating low status despite being found on temple property. Several skeletons showed evidence of healed bone fractures consistent with physical abuse. Several showed signs of death during childbirth, despite temple virgins being theoretically celibate. The lead archaeologist on the dig, Dr. Sarah Hassan, noted in her unpublished field notes, "The official explanation is these were lower-class temple servants. But the ages, the burial patterns, and the physical evidence suggest something darker. These may be temple virgins who died in service, buried secretly to avoid questions about what happened within those sacred walls." Even more disturbing is evidence from Roman-period Egypt, when Greek and Roman authors began documenting Egyptian religious practices with outsider eyes. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes visiting an Egyptian temple and witnessing maidens dedicated to the gods who seemed to live in terror of the priests, flinching at their approach. A Roman official's letter from 117 CE, recovered from the Oxyrhynchus papyri collection, complains about Egyptian temple practices. The priests maintain absolute control over girls, dedicated as virgins, permitting no oversight or inquiry into their treatment. When I attempted to interview several of these maidens to assess their welfare, the high priest claimed religious privilege and threatened to incite riots if I persisted. The emperor must decide whether Roman authority extends into these temples, or whether we permit pockets of lawlessness to persist under religious pretense. The emperor's response survives. He ordered Roman officials not to interfere with Egyptian temple practices to avoid religious unrest. Political expedients permitted continued abuse. The system finally ended not through justice but through religious change. When Christianity spread through Egypt in the 3rd–4th century CE, ancient temples were closed, their properties seized, and their practices banned. Early Christian writers documented what they found with a mixture of horror and propaganda-motivated exaggeration. But amid the exaggeration was truth. A Coptic text from the 4th century describes monks clearing out a temple of Isis and discovering chambers beneath the sanctuary where young women had been kept in conditions of great suffering, with chains and instruments of punishment. The text claims demonic influence. Modern analysis suggests they had uncovered the infrastructure of systematic abuse. So why does Nefertari's story matter? Because it demonstrates a truth we still struggle to acknowledge. Religious authority without accountability enables abuse, and sacred spaces often become prisons for the most vulnerable. The ancient Egyptian temple system wasn't unique. Similar patterns appear in sacred institutions across cultures and centuries, from Vestal virgins in Rome, to temple prostitutes in Mesopotamia, to convent abuses in medieval Europe, to modern religious institutions still facing abuse scandals today. The architecture changes. The gods' names change. The essential dynamic, adults wielding religious authority over powerless young people, remains disturbingly consistent. You've just witnessed one of ancient history's darkest secrets. If stories like this remind you that sacred spaces aren't automatically safe spaces, that religious authority demands the same accountability as any other form of power, then subscribe to Crimson Historians and help us continue uncovering the truths buried beneath ancient stones. Leave a comment. Tell us what disturbed you most about what Egyptian priests did to girls like Nefertari. And if you want more histories that challenge the sanitized versions taught in schools, step deeper into the past with us. Because understanding what happened in those temples is the only way to ensure it never happens again, regardless of whose gods claim authority over the vulnerable.